Welcome to the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast
with our mom,
Misty Bailey. Tips and encouragement
for
real-life homeschooling
is headed your way.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast. I am Misty Bailey, blogger at Joy in the Journey and podcaster here at Joyfully Homeschooling. And today's topic is how to make you and your kids hate homeschooling. Yes, I am going there. I've been homeschooling for 10 years. And while overall, my kids and I still love homeschooling, that has not always been the case. There have been times where they've been burnt out, I have been burnt out, and we have somewhat hated homeschooling. Now, this is going to be similar to the episode I talked about a few weeks ago with Devon Parks about burnout. But I think that burnout and hating homeschooling, they come from a similar scenario or time in our lives. Like, I feel burnout and I hate homeschooling when I have too much on my plate, for example. But I also think getting to the point where you hate homeschooling is a warning sign of burnout. And there are things that we can do to prevent it. And those are a little bit different, I think, than just plain burnout. So we're coming at this from a different perspective, but I do think that they're similar. I think that if you and your kids are feeling like you hate homeschooling, you might be burnt out. But I also think that sometimes we can be burnt out and still love homeschooling and want to homeschool, and our kids might still love homeschooling, but we're just in general burnout. So while they're similar, they're also different. So let's look at a few things that you can do to make you and your kids hate homeschooling. Now, I just want to clarify that none of us want our kids to hate homeschooling. So these are just things to avoid to keep you and your kids from hating homeschooling. Or if you really do hate homeschooling and you don't want to do it anymore, and you want to make your kids hate it so they don't want to be homeschooled, then do these things. But if that's you, you might be listening to the wrong podcast too. I'm just going to throw that out there. So the first thing, never take a day off. I mean, like ever. Field trip with the homeschool group? No, you have to finish up work for the week. After all, we do not want to get behind. I've literally said these words to my kids. Dad's off work for the day? Sorry, Pops. We have to do school anyway. First time in 10 years you've got a foot of snow? Doesn't matter. There are no snow days in homeschooling. Never taking a day off means always being in the books. And this is not how I want my kids to remember homeschooling. Guys, it is okay to take a sporadic day off of school. Part of the beauty of homeschooling is the fact that it is flexible. If you want your kids to hate homeschooling, never take a day off. And I just want to say, I have said every one of those words that I just mentioned. And every time I said it, it made my kids really not like homeschooling. And never taking a day off and doing those things can oftentimes lead to burnout. Nobody wants burnout. Nobody wants their kids to hate homeschooling. The next is the complete opposite. Don't do anything. No co-ops, no field trips, literally no socialization because you don't feel like it. I know people who've done this. I run a homeschool group, and there have been moms that have come through the years, and they start homeschooling for whatever reason, but they get introduced to our homeschool group, and they get invited to things, but they never come to anything. They never try to help their kids make friends. They never get to know anybody in the homeschool community, and it never fails that 6 months to a year later, they're not homeschooling anymore because their kids hate homeschooling. Well, you never did anything. You never showed them the joys of homeschooling. You never got them together with other friends. You never participated in anything. And then you complain 6 to 12 months later that your kids don't have any friends, but you never introduced them to other homeschoolers. and your kids want to go back to school because they don't know that there are other fun things they can do with homeschooling. That is a surefire way to get your kids to hate homeschooling. And I think that this is a big struggle, I think, for introverted mamas. But I mean, I've gotten moods like this too, where I've just not wanted to do anything. But I think overall, the moms that I've seen struggle with this are introverts. Jamie Erickson wrote, I think it was Jamie Erickson. I'll have to find the book. I'll leave a link in the show notes. But wrote a book about the introverted homeschool mom. And I've heard her talk on podcast before too, about being an introvert and homeschooling and the struggles that she has had with it. I know Jamie Erickson was on the podcast, but I can't remember if that's the book that she wrote or if there was another one. Like I said, I will leave a link to that in the show notes. But I also think that I've also seen the opposite, like another side to this too, where legalism comes into play, when moms worry too much about outside influences, so they don't let their kids, or dads worry about this. I've seen this a lot with dads. So they don't let their kids do sports or co-ops or things like that because they don't know what their kids are going to be exposed to at those things. And that's why we homeschool, is to keep them sheltered from all of those things. That you got to come to a point where you trust your kids and trust that you've raised them right. And our kids have to be exposed to outside influences in some capacity. And what better way to expose them than if you're with them? Our homeschool group is a Christian homeschool group. I know all of the moms in our group, but our kids have still been exposed to things that I maybe wouldn't have wanted them exposed to. But they were exposed to them in an environment where I was there, the other moms were there, and they have a relationship with me where they can talk to me about things. And I would rather them be introduced to those things under my watch than outside of my watch. And at some point, our kids are going to be exposed to these things anyway. You can't shelter them and keep them locked up forever. Believe me, you just can't. And not allowing your kids to do things is a surefire way to make them hate homeschooling. And I'm going to move on. I did have a podcast episode with Kendra Fletcher about legalism and the homeschool community. And if that's something that you struggle with, then you might go back and catch that episode. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. The next thing that you can do to make you and your kids hate homeschooling is insist on finishing the homeschool curriculum. And this is a mistake many moms make, and I've made this mistake too, and one that can lead to homeschool resentment. You pay a whole lot of money for this curriculum, only to get it and to find out that your kids hate it, but you insist on using it anyway. Your kids are in tears, you are in tears, but you insist on finishing the curriculum. And sometimes the curriculum just doesn't work, and we have to cut our losses. Believe me, I've done this a time or two. Forcing your kids to use a tool that does not fit their needs is not going to help your homeschool in any way, shape, or form. You sometimes just have to cut your losses. A similar scenario is never taking a break, like summer, because you haven't yet finished the curriculum. And think back to when you were in school. Do you remember ever finishing your school books? Ever? No, me either. Insisting on finishing the curriculum when you and your kids need a break or just don't feel like it or just don't like the curriculum is a surefire way to get your kids to hate homeschooling. My personal rule when it comes to summer break is 80%. If we have finished 80% of the books and it's time for us to start summer vacation, we stop. I don't worry about where we're at halfway through the school year as long as we're making pretty good progress. We will take our winter break. We will take spring break. But when it comes to the end of the year, 80%. And 9 times out of 10, we have been to 80% in every book, if not farther than that, by the end of the school year. And shut the books. Enjoy your break. Believe me, that is something that you and your kids need. And if you don't, then your kids will probably hate homeschooling. Another thing to consider if you hate homeschooling is ask yourself, how is your curriculum? Is it too teacher intensive considering everything else you have going on? Maybe not as hands-on as your children need. Maybe the kids just don't like it. And these are all legitimate things that will make homeschooling more difficult and make you or your kids hate homeschooling. Take a good look at your curriculum and see if there's anything that you can change that can make you and your kids like homeschooling a little bit more. And the next thing I want to mention is taking an all hands off approach. I have done this a time or two through the years, and I typically get into this rut whenever I have too much on my plate or I'm burnout, and I just take a all hands off approach. And when that happens, it oftentimes leads to my kids not being too happy with their homeschool situation. Now, I'm not against allowing children to work independently, but as a homeschool parent, we're also teachers, and teachers must be involved in their child's education. Forcing children to figure out problems themselves in regard to their school without giving them the tools they need to do so can lead children to resent homeschooling and someday hate it altogether. I have seen this played out in my homeschool group through the years, and I could think of at least a half a dozen situations where the kids get pulled out of school and they get to be homeschooled. But mom and dad never really planned on doing much with the homeschooling aspect. They enrolled them in online public school, or they bought a bunch of the little workbooks and just hand them the workbooks. But there's no engagement. There's no interaction. It's, here's a workbook, here's your work, check your answers, and that's it. And then the kids get to where they want to know how to work these things out, but they have no oversight. They have nobody helping them with their schoolwork. And when kids are left to learn on their own with little accountability, it is so easy for them to not complete an assignment or to mark something off even when they've not done it. And sometimes incomplete work's accidental, sometimes it's intentional, but it happens. And when we're not taking the time to teach our kids and to show them the lessons or to check their work and make sure they know the material, we're not homeschooling. We're not teaching them. And that is our job, moms, is to give our children a quality home education. And this cannot happen when we are lazy and when we don't follow through. And I'm a huge advocate of independent learning, and I believe it's important for our kids to be accountable for their own education. And I believe that by around third grade, they should probably be able to work somewhat on their own, at least in a subject or two. But it is not their job to be 100% responsible for their education, no matter how old they are. It's our job as parents to coach them, to teach them when needed, and to ensure their work is completed to the best of their ability. And if we're not doing that, we're not really homeschooling. And like I said, I've seen this play out many times through the years with families who have been homeschooling. Now, in our personal situation, when this has happened, not to the extreme that I mentioned, but when I've gotten super busy with work, or when I was thrown into multiple therapies with Daniel, and not home a whole lot, and I didn't give the girls a lot of oversight, or I went weeks at a time without checking their work, it would really frustrate my kids, because they would, I hadn't checked their work for 2 weeks, and then they had a test. Well, then they bombed the test because their work hadn't been checked, and they didn't know that they were doing these problems wrong because I hadn't checked their work. And so now they not only have been doing these problems wrong for 2 weeks, but now they also have a bad grade on this test because I didn't follow up and do my job. And that's a mistake that we can make too. And that can really frustrate our kids because they're not getting the kind of education that they may want or that they definitely need. And it can go either way whether it's the super duper extreme or it's just an occasional mistake here or there. We really have to watch what we're doing and make sure that our children are getting the best education possible, because if not, it's not fair to them and they will resent homeschooling. I promise you, I've seen it time and time again, and we do not want to do that to our kids, and we do not want to be that kind of homeschool parent. And sometimes these situations happen because we're too busy to homeschool. And I've been in this situation too, where whenever my grandma, for example, my grandma she passed away. It was a year ago in August. And, there was a season when I was being called to the nursing home fairly often to deal with situations with her. She had dementia, and I was the one that lived closest to the nursing home. And she would get really, really upset, really, really agitated, and forget where she was at and forget these little things. And I would be called. I'd be in the middle of doing schoolwork, and I would be called to the nursing home. And I would have to stop. I would have to stop, and I would have to go take care of this situation. But during this season, it was also when we were going through Daniel's ADHD and apraxia diagnosis. And so I was also having to drive out of town every other week to do these evaluations. And then on top of that, he broke his arm, and I was having to drive out of town again once a week for x-rays to determine whether or not he was going to need a surgery for his arm. And so I was gone a lot during that season. And on top of work and everything else going on, I was just too busy to homeschool. And that's just one example. And at some point in your homeschool season, you're gonna be busy. You're gonna be too busy to homeschool. And we would pack books along with us and try to get the kids to do school in the car. And it was just a really, really rough season. And that was the same season that led to one of our seasons of burnout, but it also really led to my kids not liking homeschooling. They even asked if they could go to school for just that season, just till things kind of calmed down. And it wasn't a long season. It was like 3 to 6 months. But it was rough. And if I had a do-over during that season, I would have cut down to just the basics, just language arts and math. I would have done audiobooks in the car, would have maybe done more field trips while we were out of town for these different appointments to kind of counteract the busy season that we were in and kind of get some of that joy back. But if we're not careful, if we don't recognize the seasons that we're in, and if we don't find ways to bring joy into our homeschool, even when things are really, really busy, we can really, really begin to resent and hate homeschooling, and our kids can too. And that's just to give you like a little bit of perspective if you're in that season. When we're too busy, when we have a lot of commitments, we get burnout, our kids get burnout, and homeschooling will not work the way that it's supposed to. Homeschooling, though, should provide us flexibility, and we should be able to be flexible. And, life will throw us curveballs, and there will be busy seasons in our homeschool. But I think it's a matter of looking at it from a new perspective, and instead of keeping things going, XYZ, pushing through and doing all of this on top of everything else we have going on during those seasons, instead of doing that, if we can just cut as much out as we can and just find those things that bring us joy, do those things that bring us the most joy in those seasons, that is a surefire way to help prevent our kids from hating homeschooling when life just absolutely gets in the way.
Podcast sponsors make the Joyfully Homeschooling podcast possible. So let's take some time to learn more about our current sponsor, Gentle Guitar. Inga and I chatted about Gentle Guitar and the importance of music in episode 109. She reminded me that our kids can get a high-quality musical education even when we can't carry a tune. Gentle Guitar can help. Music instruction is so important. Students who have early musical training will develop the areas of the brain related to language and reasoning. The left side of the brain is better developed with music, and songs can help imprint information on young minds. But wait a minute, how can you do that when you have no idea how to play a musical instrument? One resource we have been using to help in this area is Gentle Guitar. We've had more time to do fun things that interest the kids during the lockdown, and one thing Daniel has wanted to learn is how to play an instrument. This has been a productive way to keep this high-energy kiddo learning and entertained, and a bonus is the whole family can participate. Want to learn more? You can get a free trial lesson on Skype or Zoom and 20% off the first month if you use code JOY at checkout. Go to findingjoyinthejourney.net/guitar. That's findingjoyinthejourney.net/guitar to learn more about our current podcast sponsor, Gentle Guitar. Now, on with the podcast.
I want to talk a little bit too about a few things that I think can really make mom hate homeschooling. And when I first began homeschooling, I had an idea of the type of homeschool mom I wanted to be. And through the years, reality set in. And if I'm honest, I still have her in the back of my mind sometimes. And I know I'm never quite going to measure up to that homeschool mom that I thought I would be. But I can remember that I am the homeschool mom that God wants me to be. I am the perfect mom for the children that He gave me. And I think we need to remember that. And I think that too often times we can let comparison, pushing too much because we want our kids to do so much more than what they're doing. We want to push them outside of their comfort zones and make them excel in academics and all of these other things. Comparing our homeschool to other people's homeschool, comparing our kids to other people's kids, trying to balance too much, doing too much. All of these things can really take the joy out of homeschooling. And we need to realize that too often times we have these unrealistic expectations of what homeschooling is supposed to look like. And when it doesn't look like that, we think we're doing something wrong and we try to fix it. And then in the midst of all of that, we begin to really, really hate homeschooling because it's not what we thought it would be. And we need to change our expectations. We need to recognize that homeschooling isn't always going to be beds of roses. It's hard. And we can't compare our homeschool to the homeschool next door. We can't compare our kids to somebody else's kids because when we do those things, it zaps our joy and makes us lose sight of the joys and the blessings that we have in our own home. And doing that can absolutely make you resent homeschooling. It can make you hate it. And pushing your kids to fit these ideals and to fit this picture that you thought homeschooling would look like can make them hate homeschooling and make them resent you. And we don't want that, guys. We do not want that. I talk about comparison in episode 38. So be sure to go back and catch that episode. And I talk about pushing too much and like my biggest homeschool regrets and not enjoying homeschooling in episode 44. So be sure to go back and catch those two. If the idea of what I just mentioned, the comparison and not being the mom that you want to be, if that makes you hate homeschooling, be sure to go back and catch those episodes because I really think they will encourage you. And I don't know about you, but as I end this, I want to share that I want my kids to look back on homeschooling with a smile on their face. And I want them to remember it is a fun time. Yes, we have to do school, and that may not always be great, but I don't want them to hate homeschooling. I want them to love it. And every year on the first day of school, my kids are now 9th, 7th, and 2nd. They wave at the school bus. They like the fact they don't have to go off on it every day. And I don't want that to change. And I'm sure you don't want that either. So let's promise each other that we will do our best to not make our kids hate homeschooling and to make ourselves enjoy it too. And I hope these tips helped you. I hope they sharing a little bit of my mistakes helps you not make those same mistakes and helps you and your kids continue to love homeschooling. Until next time, everybody, I hope this episode helped you have a more joyful homeschool. Have a blessed and wonderful day, guys. Thanks. Bye. This has been an episode of the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast. I thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take the time to leave a rating or review on iTunes or whatever platform it is that you use to listen to this podcast. That tells the powers to be I'm not talking to myself. Also, hit subscribe. Then you will catch every episode of the Joyfully Homeschooling Podcast each week right there in your podcast feed. You can find show notes and more at joyfullyhomeschooling.com and clicking on the episode number of the episode you are looking for. Thanks, guys. I hope this podcast encouraged you to head out there and have a more joyful homeschool.